Hello, I'm Dr. Raj Balkaran, and I have the pleasure today of speaking with Dr. Archana Venkatesan on her fantastic translation of a medieval Tamil poem. The translation is called Endless Song. Hello, Archana.
Thank you so much, Raj, and thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this online virtual literary festival with translation as a focus. I'm delighted to be here and really excited to share this wonderful and remarkable poetic achievement with a wider public. So thank you very much for the opportunity. And thank you, Raj, for agreeing to curate this.
You're very welcome. Apparently, curation I can now add to my CV. So speaking of this wonderful literary achievement, this poem that you translate, what is the poem? Tell us, what is it called and what does it consist of and who's it by?
So the poem is called Thiruvaimozhi, which is a Tamil poem, probably composed around the 8th or the 9th century, the late 8th or early 9th century of the Common Era by a poet named Śaṭhakōpaṉ. And we don't know very much about him. Whatever we do know about him that's historically verifiable or biographical comes from within the poem itself in these sort of final concluding verses that end each cycle within the poem. The poem itself is quite long. It's 1102 verses, and it is structured in this cyclical pattern called the Andadi, which literally means end to beginning. So basically, it's a garland of songs where there are the last verse of the last word or syllable of a previous verse becomes the syllable of the word of the next verse. So what this means is you can start the poem in some ways at any point and end it at any point because it's essentially a garland, a cycle. And the last word of the poem is also its first word, so which is uyar, high. So and interestingly enough, uyar in the when it is used in the first verse, in the opening verse of the poem, it's sort of speaking about God, that is here identified with the god Vishnu as the highest god. And at the end, it's used to describe the highest state that one will achieve, right? So it's a wonderful kind of connection that the poem makes. It's the knot that ties up ties the poem. But the cyclical structure is kind of interesting about the poem because, as I said, you can begin and end anywhere. And so doing so gives you infinite possibilities of reading the poem and generating new kinds of interpretations, although there is obviously a traditional beginning and a traditional ending that has been received by the commentarial tradition and so forth. So it is a poem that is a mystical poem, and it's a poem that kind of is ecstatic, and it talks about this devotee, that is Śaṭhakōpaṉ's relationship with God, who is named as Vishnu Narayana in the poem, and in all of his forms, both transcendent and immanent and manifest and unmanifest. So it's also a very philosophical poem. It's an evocative poem. It's beautiful. It's a really, really remarkable poetic work.
So regarding the cyclical nature of the poem, I'm guessing that's what contributes to your decision to call it Endless Song. And also maybe say something about how befitting the cyclical nature is considering the worldview that this poem comes from.
That's a wonderful question. So the word Thiruvaimozhi literally means, it's a three Tamil words. Thiru, which means auspicious. It's also it's the Tamil word for Shri, the goddess of fortune and auspiciousness, who is also the consort of Vishnu. Vai, which means mouth, and Muri, which is language or speech. So Vai Muri, when taken together in Tamil, really means something like a sacred utterance or truth. So the literal translation would have been sacred truth or sacred speech or sacred utterance or auspicious sacred truth or spoken word. But I didn't want to go for any of those meanings for a couple of reasons. First is Nowhere in the poem does the poet refer to the poem as Thiruvaimozhi. So this is a name and a title of the poem that is given to it afterwards, when it achieves the status within this particular sect of Tamil Vaishnavas as a revealed text. It's given the status of the Southern Veda. It's referred to as the Dravida Veda. So it's really in that process that it is bestowed this title, Thiruvaimozhi. It's not a title that the poet gives the poem. In fact, but in these final sort of encapsulating verses that end every cycle within the cycle of 1100 verses, he often will refer to the poem by its structure, andadi, that is the end to end. So he will often say these 10 verses from the andadi of 1,000. So there's a self-consciousness about the structure of the text. So that is partly why I wanted to choose Endless Song, kind of getting quite close to how the poet himself sees the poem and how he himself refers to it, rather than by what the tradition calls the poem. I also wanted to allow to go for a title that was a bit more evocative of the sort of metaphoric aspect of the choosing andadi as a form for the poem, because it speaks, of course, to the endlessness, the infiniteness of and the multiplicity of God, who has neither beginning nor end, right? So the poet talks about Vishnu, describes him in this way, but it also speaks to the nature of samsara, right? This idea of the world as and us being caught in this world of birth and death, of continuous birth and death. So it's an interesting way in which the structure of the poem reflects both the transcendence and the impossible conception of God as something that is infinite, that is a cycle, right? But it also speaks to our own position caught in the cycle of birth and death that is itself endless. So that is why I sort of chose a title that speaks both to all of these aspects of the poem, the quality of the poem, what the poem is trying to sort of comment on, the relationship between God and the devotee, about the nature of existence itself. But also I feel Endless Song reflects the endlessness of the poem itself, that it really invites a kind of endless meditation, a kind of infinite immersion. That is something, it's a poem that seems to have literally has no beginning or end, but also for us who are readers of this poem, once you get into it, it feels like an ocean, really boundless and endless. So that's also, those are all of the reasons that went to choosing Endless Song. And there was a lot of debate between my editor and myself about whether to put a definite or indefinite article before it, whether to do a Endless Song or the Endless Song. In the end, we chose to do Endless Song without any of those markers, to speak to the kind of, if we felt it captures the really kind of poetic and evocative quality of the poem in a way that the Endless Song kind of feels a kind of fixity to the poem, in a way that I felt would not do justice to what this work is really achieving. So.
Well, certainly the title Endless Song without a particle like an or the,
yeah,
certainly it sort of evokes a vastness that is befitting of the poem and of the translation thereof. And when you speak of your decision to translate the title in this way, it really, I think, it really relates to or pertains to the entire process of translation that you've engaged to produce this work. In that, in my mind, it's a rendering. You're rendering something from the Tamil into English that is much more than conveying semantic sense. There's so much more that's being imparted, conveyed. And I think before we even talk about the details, how about we intersperse a little bit? How about we perhaps read a verse to give the listeners a sense of the Tamil give a sense of your rendering, and then we can intersperse conversation with this reading, if you will.
Oh, that's a wonderful idea. Thank you. Everybody should hear the beauty and wonderfulness of this poem. So what I would like to do is start with one of the first verses. So before we get started, I should explain a little bit about the structure of the poem. Because it's not 1100 verses that just go straight through, right? There's no beginning, you start here and then you end here. Rather, there's a sort of cycle within a cycle, almost Russian doll-like structure to the poem. So the 1100 verses are divided into 10 books of 100 verses each. And those 100 verses are themselves divided into songs of 10 verses that are connected or held together by a single theme, with the 11th verse, which is where we get the biographical information. This is the verse that tells us the name of the poet, where he came from, and this is where we get whatever little biographical information we have about him. This is where we get it from. And it also tells us what the benefits of reciting this verse are. So these are very interesting kind of meta verses that both exist within the poem but are also sort of set outside of it. It's also interesting because these are verses that are spoken in the third person, as opposed to most of the 10, the actual cycles, which are generally in the first person. So there's also that tension between the first and the third person. So the verse that I want to sort of start us off with is from it's the opening decad, in which the poet speaks about God, but does not name who this God is. Instead just uses pronouns, usually avan, which is he, or avar, which is the respective form. And he sort of speculates on the nature of this God, who he describes as beyond the highest, and sort of says that he is the one that whatever path you take ultimately leads to him. So it's a wonderful kind of meditation on sort of the endlessness and the sort of the transcendent qualities and attributes as well as non-attributes of the God. It's also a verse, decad, in which you see the poet's ability to use language in very simple ways. Like, he's a poet who doesn't particularly, he's not one for flowery language. He uses often very simple language, but he does so in grammatically interesting ways, sometimes ways in which grammar is, you're confused about who's the subject, who's the object. He kind of does a lot of this kind of reflexivity in the poem, and creates a kind of almost hypnotic, mesmerizing quality. So the verse I've chosen today is actually quite a famous verse, at least in the English-speaking world, because the most common way that people know this poet and this text is through the translations by the great A.K. Ramanujan in his also Penguin Classics volume, Hymns for the Drowning. This is one of the first verses in that collection, which he identifies as the paradigm. And it's a very appropriate title for this particular verse, because it's nothing more than just a recitation of all of the pronouns, of Tamil pronouns. He, she, her, it, that's it. But it's such a beautiful poem. So I wanted to maybe recite this verse and then give you my English translation and maybe talk a little bit about what I did in trying to translate this verse. So this is from the first 100, first decad, fourth verse. So that means it's 114. So first 100, first decad, fourth verse. Nam, avan, ivan, uvan, avar, ivar, uvar, yavar. Tam, avar, ivar, uvar. Adu, idu, udu, yedu. Veem avai, ivai, uvai, avai, nalam, teeng avai. Am avai, I nindra avare. So beautiful, just gorgeous sound patterns, just lovely long vowels, so few consonants are here. You know, you just get and whatever consonants are just the ends, like the the il, you know, the what's ending, so it's just a kind of openness. When you even recite it, you feel like your kind of body, you have this very embodied experience of just opening up, because it's all just nam, it's all these long vowels, nam, avan, ivan, uvar, avar, ivar, uvar, yavar, tam, avar, ivar, uvar, adu, idu, udu, yedu. So it's just this, it's, as I said, hypnotic. So how do you do this in English? Because if you just did it in literally, it's just that he, this he, the in-between he, that she, this she, the in-between she, whichever she, you know, it's literally like that, because that's all it is. And you get this, it doesn't capture that quality. So one of the things I decided to do was adopt something that the poet does, not in this particular verse, but in other verses, where he kind of breaks sort of syntax a little bit, like breaks the rules of grammar. And so I sort of decided that, what is the principle at work here? He's sort of using the grammar, and he's using language to reflect some kind of greater understanding, a kind of theology. So I decided I would do the same thing in using English. And then so instead of doing he, I did he, him, she, her, as a way to mark the sort of declensions and conjunctions that we have in English, right? So creating, because this is a paradigm in Tamil, I created the paradigm in English, as it were. So this is how I translated it in English. We, that him, this he, the in-between other, that her, the she, the other, in between, whoever. Them, there, they here, that there, this here, the in-between, whichever. All that dies, this thing, these in between, those things, the good, the bad, that which is, which will be, he becomes all there. So the other thing I also did in this verse is that one of the principles that I adopted in this translation is I reduced the amount of punctuation that I used. So there's very, very sparse punctuation, and that's deliberate because Tamil does not have punctuation. And in fact, it has sandhi like other Indian languages. So words sort of jam together, and you have to work to figure out where words end and begin. So I wanted to give that effect in English. I wanted the reader to have to, or the listener to have to work to figure out what was going on. And visually, I wanted the words to run together in a way that mimics the visuality of the Tamil as well. So that's one example.
So you're obviously, first of all, what a beautiful experiential translation. You're obviously, a translation is not a sufficient word to use here. Perhaps a rendering or transplanting or duplicating in some way, reduplicating. But so, you know, them, there, they, here, that, there, this, here, the in-between, whichever. There's the sense, of course, there's this mind-bending abstract sense that's conveyed, but there is so much more conveyed in the embodied musicality of the phrase. Them, there, they, here, that, there, this, here, the in-between, whichever.
Yes.
There is so much more rendered there than the sense of the pronouns. And so prior to reading the next verse, can you tell us a little bit more specifically about what you aim, in fact, to render well above and beyond the semantic sense, and perhaps even talk about your process in doing so?
For me, this is a very profound poem. It's a poet. It's like, it's up there, not up there. I'm always a bit leery of making these sort of comparisons, sort of, Śaṭhakōpaṉ-Nammāḻvār is the Shakespeare or the Dante of medieval South India. I'm always a bit, which is itself a process of translation, right? Because you're trying to make legible to people who don't know who Nammāḻvār is, his stature within this universe. I'm always a bit uncomfortable with making that, because he is his own person with a very specific kind of context. So for me, the poem is first and foremost, this is a poem as opposed to prose or some other format. It's a poem, which means it has, you know, it's lots of wonderful wordplay, rhythm, rhyme, all of the kinds of qualities of what we think of as poetics. But I also, but you can't lose sight of the fact that it's also a poem that is mystical, that has a very specific kind of religious point of view, that has a very specific kind of philosophical point of view, that it's using all of that, right? As I said, the very form of the poem, the Andadi, is itself a kind of making a particular kind of argument about the nature of God. So for me, it was important as a lover of poetry, who sees translation as a creative act, not just a question of, you know, trying to find the best, the closest equivalent that you can. I want the people reading this in English to really get that some kind of feeling, right? If it's not, there's no way that English can sound like Tamil, because they're as far apart as two languages can be. And so it's not that I want people to get a sense of Tamil through English, but what I want people to get is some of the qualities of the poem, right? The fact that this is the simplicity of the language. So whenever I had the chance, I always chose simple words as opposed to more complicated words. I preferred to choose words with fewer syllables as opposed to ones with more syllables, because that is kind of creating something of the sense and the sort of the flavor and the texture of the poem. And as I said, I also took my cue from the poet, who chooses to kind of, you know, make us really work hard at the poem. The poem is difficult, even though, and there are places where you really don't, even the commentators are kind of like, I wonder what is going on here, although they tried very hard to make sure that they have a reading to put forward. So those are things I adopted as my own, right? So rather than trying to solve the poem, like all those places where it's like, what is going on here? I allowed the ambiguity to remain in the poem. Or I tried to create other ways of making the reader feel slightly uncomfortable, because that is also what you feel as a reader of the Tamil. So there's this idea that, oh, if you're a Tamil reader and you read this poem, it's absolutely clear to you. It's not the case. So example, the choice to do away with punctuation, for instance. I used a lot of enjambment to create that sense of suspension, where as well as that feeling of the Tamil, where you have a lot of sandhi, right? These where the words are kind of joined together. So I sort of did all of these kinds of, I sought to kind of create those textual elements in the poem, but I kept the language stark and simple. I chose very deliberately to use fewer syllables. I disciplined myself, ensuring that each verse in each decade always had the same number of lines, so that although it's free verse, it's not without a structure, because the Andadi is impossible to recreate in English. So those were some of the ways in which I've tried to bring over, to cross over some of the ways the poet makes this a poem, right? So the poetry was very important to me, as was also preserving some of the ambiguity. I'm also a translator who doesn't believe translation is just about, is some form of interpretation where I have to kind of it has to make perfect sense to the reader in English. I don't see myself as an interpreter in that sense. I mean, certainly the act of translation is interpretive act, but I don't see myself as, if there's a part in the poem that doesn't make sense, I want it not to make sense in English, and I want my reader to I don't want to say struggle, because that's a terrible thing to say, but I would rather say I would like the reader, I don't like to kind of make my translations completely transparent, that there has to be a kind of engagement, a kind of active, and you have to sort of work hard with your text, along with your text, as opposed, just as you would in the original language. This was not easy for me to translate, even though I'm a native speaker of Tamil. This was not easy for me to translate, and I struggled with it. And I want that part of that struggle to be there in English as well.
Well, it seems that the complexity of the language is an invitation for the reader to work, to put their own work in towards their own aha moment. And that's, you know, if you want the coconut water, it's sweeter when you crack the coconut yourself.
That is true.
You know?
Yes, absolutely.
And so why don't you share a couple of verses with us so we can get a sense of this luscious work as well as your masterful translation.
Okay, wonderful. So I'm going to do, I chose to do a couple of different verses. One, which I think, so one of the interesting things about this poem that is not unique to this poet is that he uses the female voice a number of times in the poem. And the female voice is all kinds of female voices. So he uses the voice of the heroine's mother, the friend, the fortune teller, and in two decades at the end of the poem, the voice of the cowherd girls of this imaginal world of Krishna's Vrindavan. So they're very, very interesting verses. They're usually verses of longing, of separation. To me, they're a full quarter of the Tiruvaimuri. So of the 1100 verses, about 270 are in 27 decades, are in the voice of the woman, of which the majority are in the voice of the woman, the beloved, who is in love with God. These are some of the most stirring and beautiful poems. The tradition, the commentators have a very pithy way of describing this. In Tamil, they say, "Ñānathil tampeche," and in separation, the female voice. That is, when they are in joined together, when it's in union, he speaks in his own voice, and when he speaks in the voice of the heroine, he's speaking in the voice of viraha, or separation. So here, so that's one way to think about these verses, although there are very beautiful verses where he's speaking in his own voice, or what we think of as his own voice, as you know, of longing. So one of the verses that I chose was actually from the 5th hundred, so it's sort of in between, right in the middle of the text, and it's one of the hundreds, the 5th hundred, where you have the most number of female voiced poems. There are hundreds where there are no female voiced poems at all, and the 5th hundred is one where you actually have a whole bunch of them, and several of them actually come back to back, one after the other. So the one I chose was actually, hold on, I have to find it in the Tamil. I didn't choose it ahead of time. Is the one where it's actually got two voices, the heroine's voice and the mother's voice. And the verse is split into two parts, and this entire decade has so the first part is in the heroine's voice and the second part is in the mother's voice. But we figure out at the end of the poem, it's actually the mother reporting what she's hearing her daughter say. But it's interesting because it's a poem of possession, where what the mother is observing is the daughter saying that I'm God, right? So she's saying, I'm doing all of the things that Vishnu does, I'm doing. And so the whole decade is, I created the world, I made the world, I killed this demon, I lifted the mountain, and so on and so forth. I am the wind, I am the elements, and so on and so forth. So the mother is like, so the first half of the verse is always the daughter speaking these kinds of, making these kind of wild claims. And then the mother going, she's saying all of these things, I don't understand what is going on. The Tamil, again, is very, very simple. They're just sort of statements. And so I'll just read the first verse. This is from the 5th hundred, 6th decade, first verse. So 561. So, Kadal Nyalam Sedenum Yane Yennum. Kadal Nyalam Ave Nenum. Yane Yennum. See, you see, it's very, very simple. The same words are being used. Kadal ñānam kondenum, yane yennum. Kadal ñānam kīndenennum, yane yennum. Kadal ñānam mundenennum, yane yennum. Kadal ñālattu ஈசன் வந்து, it's finally changing the language. கடல் ஞாலத்து ஈசன் வந்து ஏற்கொள்ளோ கடல் ஞாலத்திற்கு இவை என் சொல்லுகேன் கடல் ஞாலத்து என் மகள் கற்கின்றவே. It's very beautiful. So it's just literally like, as I said, it's just like the Namavan verse. It's just kadal ñālam sedenum, I created the world. Kadal ñālam avenum, I am the ocean. Kadal ñālam kondenum, I took the ocean. Kadal ñālam kindenum, I dug the I dug the ocean and the world. So it's each line juxtaposes the ocean and the earth. So kadal ñālam sedenum, I made the ocean and I made the earth. Kadal ñālam avenum, I am the ocean. I become the ocean and I become the earth. Kadal ñālam kondenum, I took the earth and the ocean. Kadal ñālam kindenum, I dug the ocean and earth. So you see, it's like a basic Tamil 101 kind of language, but the way it builds creates such an effect. So I'll just read to you my translation of this particular. 561. I made oceans, I made this earth. I became oceans, I became this earth. I took oceans, I took this earth. I split oceans, I split this earth. I swallowed oceans, I swallowed this earth. Has the Lord of oceans, Lord of this earth, taken her? What else do I say about my daughter who wanders saying such things? So it's a very beautiful verse.
That's quite beautiful. We, believe it or not, we are close to our half an hour.
Okay,
and
very
so,
good.
So maybe just read, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I was going to say that actually the reason I chose this verse as one of the verses for the female voice is because of one of the claims that the poet makes, and the reason for the claim about the poem being a revealed work is that many, many times during the poem, he'll say that he's speaking, God is speaking through him, that God is the poet and he's simply repeating the words. So the reason I chose this particular verse, decad, as to represent the female voice was because something at the very, very end of the poem where he talks about being God's poet and then warns other poets saying, be careful, have a care because this may happen to you too. So.
It's beautiful. So perhaps you can just say a quick word on how to say, who should read this poem, or what can one get from this poem, or is this for those looking for a path to Vishnu? Is this for anyone interested in poetry? Is it something in between? Tell us a bit about that.
Well, obviously the natural audience for it is anybody who's interested in Tamil devotional poetry or Indian or South Asian devotional and mystical poetry. But my experience working with this poem for now several years is that it's a masterpiece of world literature. It really deserves a much wider audience. It deserves to be read and relished and enjoyed beyond its Vaishnava worldview, but beyond this world of just of devotees. And so it's a poem that's primarily, known within that world. It is an extraordinary work. And for me, I'm hoping that this will be a translation that will bring people to this great poet. And in terms of the world of scholars, I hope it will inspire other scholars to work on this poet, and that other translations, different kinds of translations with different approaches will take it up, because that is for me the great hope, is that this poem is discovered by people who love poetry, people who love who are interested in sort of the mystical and sort of the relationship between the mystical and the poetic, and of course people who are interested in sort of the devotional traditions in South Asia. But yeah, I would like this poem to be something that that brings people to just who love poetry. That is for me very, very important.
Well, what's very interesting is that, although I am an expert in Hinduism, broadly speaking, this isn't a genre or a movement or a theology or an era that I work on. And so this poem is off my radar in terms of what I study. And having said that, having had the good fortune of covering this poem on the New Books in Hindu Studies Network, the lover of poetry in me is really relishing it. And it's something that I wish to return to, not to understand the history of Hinduism, but it's something that I wish to return to understand something of the human heart. Perhaps you can just end, read 10-10 for us, 10-10-10. Just give them a flavor.
I thought actually I would end with the verse on, since we were talking about poetry, I thought I would end by talking about the verse where he speaks about God as a poet. Is that okay?
Sure, why not?
Okay. So this is the 10th hundred, so it's the final 100, 7th decade, first verse, 10-7-1. It's in Tamil. Sensol kavigal uyirkaathu ஆச்சைமின் திருமாலிரின் சோலை வஞ்சக்கள்வன் மாமாயன் மாயக்கலியாய் வந்து என் நெஞ்சம் உயிரும் உள் கலந்து நின்றார். So beautiful. அரியா வண்ணம் என் நெஞ்சும் உயிரும் அவையுண்டு தானே நிறைந்தானே. It's just so gorgeous. This is one of those verses where the Tamil is quite simple. The language is very simple. The words, there's like no word in here that is not a word we use even today, but it's a very difficult verse in terms of grammar. So this is a wonderful poem for poets. Poets of fine words, take care. The cunning thief, the great trickster of that Tirumalarin Chole, stole into my heart and into my life. A magical poet, he dissolved into me, remained there, unknown, devoured my life, devoured my heart, then filled me with himself.
Ladies and gentlemen, I've been speaking with Dr. Archana Venkatesan on her masterful translation of this brilliant medieval Tamil poem. Please, if you haven't already, have a look at Endless Song. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Raj, for giving me this opportunity and having such wonderful questions for me. And for Marianne for bringing me the opportunity to share this work with all of you. And I hope you enjoy reading it. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.